Welcome back, history lovers. Tonight, we step out of the cold and into the only building in the entire village that never truly goes dark. The bakehouse. You've seen the romantic version, of course. Golden loaves cooling on a wooden rack, flour drifting through a sunbeam, a cheerful, round-faced man in a white apron pulling bread from a stone oven while a fiddle plays somewhere in the background. Forget all of that. The real medieval baker worked in a windowless brick box that reached the temperature of a small hell, started his day at an hour most of us consider the middle of the night, and lived under laws so brutally specific that a loaf a few ounces light could get him dragged through the streets on a wooden sled with the evidence tied around his neck. Before we begin, if you enjoy these long, slow journeys into the past, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely want more of them. And let me know down in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. It's always strangely comforting to see this quiet little crowd gathering from every corner of the world. Now dim the lights, get the blankets exactly how you like them, let your shoulders drop, and let's ease into it together. You were born above the oven. That's not a metaphor. In most medieval towns, the bakehouse was the ground floor and the family lived directly above it, which meant your first memories are of warmth rising through the floorboards and the low. Constant breathing sound of a fire that was never allowed to die completely. Other children grew up learning the rhythm of church bells. You grew up learning the rhythm of your father going down the stairs in the dark. 2 hours after midnight, most nights, sometimes earlier, you'd hear the creak, the scrape of the shovel, the clatter of wood, and then the room would slowly grow warmer beneath you, and you'd fall back asleep on top of an oven that was heating up to bake bread for people who wouldn't be awake for another 5 hours. Your father is a baker, which means your grandfather was a baker, which means you are going to be a baker. There was no discussion about this. In a world of guilds, trades passed down through blood like eye colour, and the family oven, that enormous, expensive, temperamental beast of brick and clay, was the single most valuable thing your family would ever own. You don't inherit land. You don't inherit a title. You inherit a hole in the wall that gets hot, and the right, granted by the town or the lord or the guild, to put bread in it. By the age of 6 or 7 you are working, not helping. Working, your first job is the least skilled and most endless one, hauling. Wood, mostly, a single day's baking could burn through an astonishing amount of fuel, and somebody had to stack it, carry it, split it, and keep it dry. But somebody is you, and you are the height of a small barrel. You also carry water, which is heavier than wood and far less forgiving when you spill it. You sweep, you scrape, you pick stones and grit and mouse droppings out of the flour by hand, one small handful at a time, because sand in the bread means a complaint, and a complaint means a fine, and a fine means your family doesn't eat that week. And the flour, let's talk about that, because flour is not the clean white powder you're imagining. Flour in the medieval world arrived from the miller, and the miller was, universally across all of Europe, for roughly 1,000 years, the most distrusted man in any village. Everyone assumed the miller was skimming. Sometimes he was. Your father would weigh what came back from the mill against what went in, mutter about it, and then bake with it anyway, because what else was he going to do? And the grain itself was rarely pure wheat. It was wheat mixed with rye, or rye mixed with barley, or in a bad year, whatever could be scraped together and ground into something that would hold together when wet. Some of it had spent months in a damp granary. Some of it had things living in it. You learned to feel flour between your fingers before you trusted it. Your father is not a warm man, though he stands in front of a furnace for most of his waking life. Bakers were, by the nature of the job, chronically exhausted people operating on a sleep schedule that would be considered a medical crisis today. He speaks in short instructions. More wood. Not yet. Move, his forearms are marked from wrist to elbow with a constellation of small pale burn scars, each one from a moment he reached slightly too far into the oven mouth, and you will have that same constellation by the time you're 20. He shows you things once. If you don't catch it, you catch it wrong, and then you catch a cuff to the back of the head, and then you learn it properly. Here is the thing that will define your entire existence, and it's worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains everything that follows. Bread was not a side dish in the medieval world. Bread was food. For the vast majority of people, bread supplied somewhere between half and 3/4 of every calorie they consumed in a day, and the quantities were staggering by modern standards. A working adult might eat 1 to 2 pounds of it daily. Every single day, forever, bread was breakfast. Bread was the plate your dinner sat on. Stale bread thickened your soup. Bread was what you gave a beggar, what you offered a guest, what the priest held up at the altar. When people prayed for their daily bread, they were not being poetic. They were being extremely literal. Which means you, the baker, are not a shopkeeper. You are infrastructure. If your oven goes cold, people go hungry, and hungry people in a walled town become an angry crowd remarkably fast. This gave you a strange kind of power, and it is exactly why the authorities spent centuries making sure you never enjoyed it. Before you can bake anything, though, you have to feed the oven, and the oven is the true master of the house. Understand what you're dealing with: a domed chamber of brick or clay, thick-walled, with a single mouth at the front and no chimney to speak of in the earlier centuries, just an opening and a hope. You don't heat it from below, you build the fire inside it, directly on the floor where the bread will later sit. And you keep that fire burning for hours, feeding it, spreading it, until the entire mass of brick has soaked up enough heat to cook by itself. That's the trick. The oven doesn't cook with flame, it cooks with stored heat, released slowly over a long afternoon, and everything you bake that day must be arranged around a temperature that only ever falls. So the night begins with fire. You rake the coals out, all of them, scraping the floor clean with a long-handled tool while the heat comes off the opening in a wall you can feel on your face from 6 feet away. Then you swab the oven floor with a wet cloth or a bundle of damp rags lashed to a pole, and steam explodes back out at you. And if you are careless with the angle, that steam removes a layer of skin from your forearm. This is a normal Tuesday. Now the oven is clean and hot and utterly indifferent to you, and you have a window, a few hours maybe, in which to get everything baked in the correct order before it cools past usefulness. How do you know the temperature? You don't, not in any way we'd recognise. There is no dial, no thermometer, no glass window. There is your hand, held in the mouth of the oven, counting. There is the colour of the brick. A good baker could read the inside of his own oven the way a sailor reads weather, watching for the moment the soot burned away and the surface went pale. There's the flour test. Scatter a pinch across the floor and watch what it does. Browns slowly. You're not ready. Vanishes in a flash of black. You're too hot, and the loaves will burn on the bottom before the middle sets. Everything about this job is judgment built out of thousands of repetitions, stored in a man's hands and eyes, and passed to his son by standing next to him for 20 years. Meanwhile, the dough is happening, and dough in a world without packaged yeast is its own kind of tyranny. You keep a portion of yesterday's fermented dough back. The leaven, the mother, the balm skimmed off the top of the brewer's ale if you're near a brewery, and that living thing is the engine of your entire business. If it dies, if it goes sour, if it freezes in a hard winter or drowns in a careless mixing, you have no bread. Not tomorrow, not for days. So you feed it. You wrap it. In some households you take it to bed with you in a crock to keep it warm, which tells you something about medieval priorities, because that leaven is worth more than most of what you own. And the kneading, enormous wooden troughs, arm deep in a mass of dough stiff enough to fight back, worked by hand in a room already at the temperature of a summer afternoon, for hours, in the dark, by candlelight, or by the glow leaking out of the oven mouth. Your shoulders will ache in a way that never fully stops. Your wrists will go first, then your lower back, and by the time you're 40 you'll have the joints of a much older man. Bakers were known for it. There's a reason so many of them ended up with the particular stoop of someone who spent 30 years leaning over a trough at the same angle. Then there's the flour itself. The fine dust of it, always in the air, always in the light. Drifting and settling on every surface, including the insides of your lungs. Breathe it every night for decades, and it does what you'd expect it to do. There's a cough that comes with the trade, a wheeze, a tightness, a condition that has been recognised under one name or another since antiquity, and that has followed bakers into the modern world with barely a change. You don't have a word for it. You just know that older bakers breathe badly, and that this is simply what happens to men who do what you do. So that's the shape of it. You wake in the dark, you feed a fire that could burn down the entire street if you're careless, you fight a trough full of dough with a body that's already complaining, and you get the bread out before the town wakes up expecting it. It's hot, it's heavy, it's relentless, and it happens 6 days a week for your entire life. And honestly, all of that is the easy part. Because the truly miserable thing about being a medieval baker was never the oven, or the hours, or the flour, or the burns. It was the law. It was the fact that of every trade in the medieval town, every tanner, cooper, weaver, and butcher, you were the one the authorities watched most closely, weighed most carefully, and punished most publicly. And in the next section, we'll find out exactly what they did to a baker whose loaves came up light. Here is the sentence that shaped a medieval baker's entire life, and it sounds so harmless when you first hear it. The price of bread was fixed. Not the weight, the price. Bread cost what it cost. A farthing loaf was a farthing loaf, in a good year and a bad one, in a town flush with grain and a town scraping the bottom of the granary. What changed instead was the size. When wheat was cheap, the farthing loaf swelled up fat and generous. When wheat was dear, that same farthing bought you a shrunken little thing that looked like it had been left out in the sun. And the exact permitted weight for every grade of loaf, at every price of grain, was written down, published, and enforced by men whose entire job was to catch you giving people less than they were owed. In England, this was the assize of bread and ale, and versions of it existed across Europe under different names for centuries. Think about what that actually meant for you. Standing in your bakehouse at 4 a.m. You are not a businessman who sets his own prices and lives with the consequences. You are a man operating inside a legal formula. Grain goes up, your loaves must shrink by a precise published amount. Grain goes down, they must grow. You have to know the current price of wheat at market, not roughly, exactly, because the town's official tables convert that price into the ounces you are legally required to deliver. And nobody anywhere in that chain was interested in whether you made a profit. That's the part that grinds a man down over 30 years. Your costs were not fixed. Firewood cost what firewood cost, and in a hard winter with the roads frozen, it cost a great deal more. The miller took his cut. The grain merchant took his. Your rent on the bakehouse, your tools, your apprentice's food, the salt, the repairs to a cracked oven dome, all of it moved. And none of it moved in your favour. But the loaf could not go up a single coin. So the only variable left, the only place where a baker could find a little breathing room, was in the weight of the bread itself. Shave an ounce. Just one. Nobody's going to notice 1 ounce on a loaf. The authorities knew this. Of course they knew. That is precisely why they built an entire apparatus of inspection around you. Every town had officers for it. Ale conners, bread weighers, market wardens, men appointed by the guild or the corporation or the Lord's Court, depending on where you lived. They came without warning. They walked into your shop while the loaves were still cooling, picked one at random, and put it on a balance against a set of standard weights that lived in a locked chest in the Guildhall. There was no arguing with the balance. Your dough was heavier when it went in than when it came out. Bread loses weight as it bakes, as water steams away, and how much it loses depends on the heat, the time, the flour, the day. A batch that ran a little hot could come up light through no dishonesty whatsoever. It didn't matter. The balance didn't care about your reasons. And the penalties escalated in a way that was designed to be remembered. First offence, you paid a fine, tallied and recorded in the court rolls, and if you look at those rolls today, you find bakers appearing in them so regularly that some historians have argued the fines functioned less like punishment and more like an unofficial licensing tax, a cost of doing business that everyone quietly understood and nobody quite admitted, but keep coming up light, and the town stopped treating it as revenue and started treating it as an insult. Then came the pillory. You were put in a wooden frame in the marketplace, on market day, at the busiest hour, with your head and hands locked in place, and the offending loaf hung around your neck on a cord so that everyone passing could see exactly what you had done and exactly how much you had stolen. Sometimes it was a whole string of loaves. The point was not the discomfort. The point was that your face and your crime were displayed together to every customer you would ever have again. And in the worst cases, there was the hurdle. A baker convicted repeatedly could be tied to a wooden frame, a sledge essentially, and dragged through the streets behind a horse, over the mud and the filth and the refuse of the town, from his own shop to the pillory, with the bad bread tied to him. In London this was recorded in careful detail, the route, the offence, the weight of the shortfall, and after enough offences, the final blow, the one that ended the family line in that town, you were forsworn the trade, banned, your right to bake, the thing your grandfather had held and your father had held, taken away by a court and never given back for a few ounces of bread. Now, before you decide the authorities were simply cruel, understand what they were afraid of. Bread was the base of the entire social order. When bread failed, cities burned. Every ruler in Europe knew, in his bones, that a hungry urban population was the most dangerous thing in the world, and that the shortest possible distance between a bad harvest and a riot ran directly through the baker's door. So they made the baker visible. They made him accountable in public, physically, in the marketplace, so that when bread got small and expensive, which it inevitably did, the crowd's anger had somewhere to go that wasn't the Lord's gate. You were the pressure valve. That was the job nobody explained to you when you were 6 years old hauling firewood. And it worked on you psychologically in a way that's hard to overstate. You weighed things constantly. Obsessively, your hands knew the weight of a proper loaf the way a musician's fingers know a chord, and still you weighed them, because your hands could be wrong and the town's balance could not. You kept your own scales, checked against the standard, checked again. You made your loaves slightly heavy on purpose, giving away flour you couldn't afford to give, because being generous cost you money and being light cost you your skin. And you developed the little tricks that bakers everywhere developed, some honest, some not. Here's the one that's still with us. Bakers in England took to adding an extra loaf to every dozen sold to a merchant or a hawker, 13 instead of 12, so that if any single loaf in the batch happened to come up light, the total weight still covered what the buyer had paid for. That's the baker's dozen, not generosity. Insurance, every time you hear that phrase, you're hearing the ghost of a man who did not want to be dragged through the mud on a sledge. Then there were the other tricks, and let's be honest about them, because bakers did not universally deserve their reputation for honesty. There is the famous accusation, preserved in medieval court records with a kind of gleeful outrage, of the baker who cut a hidden trapdoor into the top of his kneading trough. A customer would bring in his own dough to be baked. This was common, since most households couldn't afford their own oven, and set it on the counter, and while the baker chatted and gestured and drew the eye, a boy hidden underneath would reach up through the hatch and pinch away handful after handful of the customer's dough. Fresh dough, stolen from beneath, added to the baker's own stock. The customer got his bread back a little smaller and never quite knew why. Whether that particular case was as widespread as the records suggest, or simply too good a story not to repeat, it tells you exactly how the public felt about you. The baker in medieval literature is almost never a hero. He's a schemer. He's the man with his thumb on the scale, in league with the miller, cheating the poor. Chaucer's miller had a thumb of gold, which everyone understood to be a joke about pressing it into the weighing pan. Bakers got the same treatment. You lived your entire life doing punishing physical labour in the dark to feed people who assumed, as a matter of course, that you were robbing them. And sometimes you were adulterating the flour, though rarely for the reasons people imagined. In a bad year, and bad years came often, there simply wasn't enough grain. So you stretched it. Beans, peas, bran, acorns in the truly desperate seasons, ground and mixed in to make the flour go further. The authorities forbade it, the guild forbade it, and everyone did it anyway, because the alternative was to have no bread at all. The darker, coarser breads of the medieval world, the maslin loaves of mixed wheat and rye, the horse bread of beans and bran that was supposedly for animals and quietly wasn't, were the honest products of scarcity. Nobody ate them by choice. They ate them because white bread, the fine manchet loaf, sifted through cloth until it was pale and light, cost more than most people saw in a week. That, incidentally, is where an entire language of class comes from. Fine white flour for the lord's table, coarse brown for the household, bran heavy trenchers for the servants, and the trencher itself, a thick slab of stale dark bread used as a plate, soaking up grease and juice through the meal, got handed down afterward to the poor at the gate, who ate the plate. You could determine a man's exact position in the world by looking at the colour of what he was eating, and you, the baker, were the one who sorted humanity into those grades every single morning. In many towns the law made it official. Bakers were divided by what they were permitted to produce. The white bakers and the brown bakers, in London, kept as separate companies for generations, each with their own guild, their own rules, and a long-running mutual resentment about who was allowed to sell what. Cross the line and bake the wrong grade, and you were back in front of the court again. Even your ambition was regulated. And above all of it sat the guild, which was simultaneously your protector and your jailer. It kept outsiders from setting up in competition. It set the standards, resolved disputes, buried you when you died, and looked after your widow, a genuine safety net in a world with almost none. It also decided how many years you'd serve as an apprentice, how long you'd wait as a journeyman, whether you could ever open your own shop, and what you were allowed to charge for what. It fined you, it inspected you, it could expel you. An expulsion from the guild meant expulsion from the trade, which in a walled town with a fixed number of ovens meant expulsion from your life. So picture your position honestly now. You are legally obligated to sell at a price you don't set, made from grain you can't control, in weights you can be jailed for missing, under the supervision of a guild that owns your career and a town that considers you a suspect by default, using an oven that will maim you if you lose concentration for a single second. And you haven't even opened the shop door yet, because when the sun finally comes up and the town wakes, the real chaos begins. The queue, the shouting, the housewives with their own dough under their arms, the endless negotiation of credit and debt, and one particular problem that could turn your entire street to ash in an afternoon. We'll get to the fire. The door opens, and the street comes in. There is a particular sound a medieval town makes at dawn. The shutters banging, the carts on the cobbles, the animals, the bells, and every bit of it converges on your doorway, because you are the first shop open and the one thing every single person needs before they can start their day. You have been awake for 6 hours already. You have not eaten. Your arms are shaking slightly from the trough, and the front of your tunic is stiff with dried dough and streaked with ash. And now, for the next several hours, you have to be a merchant. The first thing to understand about the medieval bakehouse is that most of your customers are not simply buying bread. A very large portion of them are bringing you theirs. Ovens were expensive, enormously so. A proper baking oven required brick or dressed stone, a mason who knew what he was doing, and a constant, terrifying appetite for fuel that no ordinary household could feed. Beyond that, in many parts of Europe, private ovens were straightforwardly illegal. The lord held the right to the oven the same way he held the right to the mill and the wine press. The banal rights they were called. And in France, the four banal, the Lord's oven, was a monopoly that entire villages were legally compelled to use and pay for. You might be operating that oven on the Lord's behalf, taking a share and passing the rest upward. In free towns, it was the guild that held the line instead. Either way, the result was the same. The town had one oven for every few dozen households, and you were standing in front of it. So they come with dough under a cloth, whole families' worth, kneaded at home in the small hours by wives and daughters who did the mixing so they wouldn't have to pay for the flour and the labour both. They hand it over, and you bake it, and you charge for the heat, sometimes in coin. Sometimes you keep a portion of the dough itself, or take a loaf out of every batch, which was standard and understood and still generated arguments every single week. And here is where the job becomes something like air traffic control, conducted by a man who hasn't slept. Because you now have 30 different lumps of dough on your counter, made by 30 different households, from 30 different grades of flour, at 30 different stages of rising, and every single one of those women will know her own bread on sight when it comes back out. You mark them. Every family had a mark, a cross cut into the crust, a pattern of pricks, a shape pressed into the top with a wooden stamp, so that the loaves could be told apart. That's where a great deal of decorative bread scoring comes from, incidentally, not artistry. Bookkeeping. Get it wrong and you have not made an error, you have committed theft. Give Alice's fine wheaten loaf to Margaret, and hand Alice back Margaret's coarse maslin, and you will hear about it in the street, and then in the church, and then in front of the warden. Bakers were sued over this, regularly. And the oven itself imposes a merciless order on all of it. Remember, the heat only falls. So there's a hierarchy to what goes in and when, and it's a hierarchy you cannot violate. The hottest first, the loaves that need a fierce initial blast to spring properly. Then the ordinary bread as the temperature settles into its long useful middle. Then, as it drops further, the pies, the pasties, the things that want a gentler bake. And at the very end, in the dying warmth, the slow things, dried fruit, cured meat, the pot of beans or pottage some neighbour asked you to leave in overnight, biscuits baked twice until they were hard enough to survive a sea voyage. You are managing a falling curve of heat, with dozens of items competing for the good parts of it, and every item belongs to a different person who has paid you and is standing outside expecting theirs to be perfect. Now add the peel, the long wooden paddle, the tool that has become the universal symbol of your trade, and the reason your shoulders will fail you by 50. A loaded peel is heavy, and you are holding it out at arm's length, extended into a chamber the temperature of a bonfire, and you have to place the loaf precisely, not too near the mouth where it'll be underdone, not too near the back where the last one burned, not touching its neighbour or they'll fuse into a single mass. Then a flick of the wrist to slide the loaf off and pull the peel back clean. Then again. 30, 40, 60 times, in fast succession with the heat coming off the opening onto your face and forearms and the edges of your eyes, while your apprentice hands you the next one. The burns are constant, and they are so routine that nobody remarks on them. The back of your right hand and the inside of your right forearm are a permanent record of every moment you misjudged the distance. Your eyebrows are thin. Your eyelashes have been singed off more than once. In summer, in a room already at the temperature of a hot bath, you work stripped to the waist, and the sweat runs and the flour sticks to it, and you end the morning coated in a grey paste of your own making. This, by the way, is why bakers everywhere in medieval art and literature are drawn the way they are, half-dressed, red-faced, glistening. It's not caricature, it's observation. But let's talk about the thing that hung over every bakehouse in every town in Europe, the one that turned an ordinary night into a catastrophe that people were still telling stories about 100 years later. Fire. Medieval towns were built of timber and thatch, packed tight, with upper stories leaning out over the street until neighbours could almost shake hands across the gap. There was no water supply worth the name, there was no organised firefighting beyond a bucket chain, a few long hooks for pulling down burning roofs, and prayer. A fire that got established in a street like that did not stop until it ran out of street. And you, the baker, kept an open fire burning inside a building in that street. All night. Every night. Forever. Everybody knew it. Town after town passed ordinances trying to manage the risk, rules about where bakehouses could be sited, requirements that they be built of stone, curfew laws about covering fires at night, orders that a baker must keep a full vessel of water at hand at all times, prohibitions on thatched roofs above ovens. Some towns pushed bakers to the edges of the settlement or down by the river, which was safer for everyone and worse for business. Bakers were, in the eyes of the town, a necessary hazard, like keeping a small controlled dragon in the cellar, and every so often the dragon got out. The pattern of medieval and early modern urban fire is grimly consistent. A great many of them started in a bakehouse, or a brewhouse, or a smithy, because those were the three trades that kept fire burning through the night. A stack of firewood too close to the mouth, a spark carried on a draught into dry straw, an oven wall cracked by decades of expansion and contraction, quietly leaking heat into a timber beam it had been resting against for 40 years, until, one night, that beam finally gave up and began to smoulder. The most famous of them all, the one that consumed the medieval city of London in 1666, began in a baker's premises on Pudding Lane. That's a couple of centuries past our period, but the mechanism was exactly the same one that had been burning down town since the 12th century, and the baker in that story spent the rest of his life insisting his oven had been properly out. Perhaps it had. It didn't matter. Everyone knew where the fire started, and everyone knew whose trade it was. So you live with that. You bank the fire. You check it. You check it again before you go up the stairs. You wake at some hour of the night with a jolt, absolutely certain you smell smoke, and go down in the dark to stand in front of the oven and listen to it and stare at the corner where the beam meets the brick. And then you go back to bed for the 90 minutes remaining before you have to get up anyway. That's not anxiety exactly. It's just the ordinary weight of being the man in the street who is responsible for the fire. Meanwhile, out at the front, you were running a credit business, whether you wanted to or not. Coin was scarce. Genuinely, physically scarce, small denominations especially, and most working people simply did not carry money most of the time. So, bread was bought on account. Widow Hale takes 2 loaves a day and settles at harvest. The carpenter's family runs a tally through the winter and pays when work picks up in the spring. And the tally, in a largely illiterate world, was often literal, a wooden stick notched with the debt, split lengthwise down the middle, one half to you and one half to them, so that neither could add a notch without the 2 halves failing to match when put back together. It's a beautifully simple piece of technology, and it existed because nobody trusted anybody, least of all the baker. You extend credit because if you don't, you have no customers, and because these are your neighbours and you'll be sitting near them in church on Sunday. And then some of them don't pay. Some of them can't. Some of them die owing you 3 months of bread, and you stand at the funeral of a man whose family owes you more than you can afford to lose. And you say nothing, because what exactly are you going to do? The debts sit in your chest like stones. You know precisely who owes what. You could recite it in your sleep, and frequently do. And through all of it, all day, the same conversation, on repeat, from people who genuinely believe they are the first ever to say it. The loaf is smaller than it was. And you explain. Again, that grain is up, that the price is set by law, and so is the weight, and you had no say in either, that you did not make this rule, that you have never in your life set the price of anything, that the assize came down from the Guildhall on a written schedule that you can show them if they'd like to see it, which they wouldn't, because they can't read it, and neither, in many cases, can you. They don't believe you. They never believe you. They look at the loaf, and they look at you, a man standing in the warmest room in town, surrounded by food, who eats every day, and they do the arithmetic, and the arithmetic tells them you are doing well out of their hunger. And the terrible thing, the thing you'd never say aloud, is that in one narrow sense they're right. You do eat every day. In a famine year when the countryside is starving and people are grinding bark, the man standing next to the flour is one of the last to go hungry. Bakers survived bad years better than most. That was not a secret, and it was not forgiven. Which brings us to what happened when a year went truly, catastrophically wrong, when the rain didn't stop, when the harvest failed 2 seasons running, and a crowd gathered outside a shop that had nothing left to sell. Because there is a reason the phrase bread riot exists, and the baker is always standing at the centre of it. The rain begins in spring and it does not stop. That's how it starts, always, and every baker who lives long enough sees it at least once. Not a dramatic catastrophe. No army, no plague, no fire, just weather. Weeks of grey water falling on fields that needed sun, seed rotting in ground too wet to drain, hay that never dries, and the slow, sick realization spreading through a whole countryside that this year is going to be short. You know before anyone else does. You know it in the price. The baker's eye is permanently fixed on the grain market, because grain is the only thing standing between you and ruin, and you learn to read it the way a farmer reads the sky. Wheat creeps up a little in June. That's normal, that's the hungry gap before harvest, it happens every year. But then it doesn't come back down in August, because the harvest that should have flooded the market with cheap grain has come in thin and damp and mildewed. And in September, when prices should be at their floor, they hold. And in October, they rise. That's the moment your stomach drops, because you can do the arithmetic. If wheat is expensive in October, what will it be in March? Under the assize, the loaf shrinks, legally, mechanically, on schedule. The farthing loaf that fed a family in a good year becomes a modest thing, then a small thing, then something you're almost embarrassed to hand across the counter. And the people who buy it don't experience this as an economic adjustment. They experience it as the baker giving them less bread. The complaints stop being grumbles and start being accusations. Where has it gone? You've got it hidden. You're keeping it back for the rich, for the abbey, for the Lord's household who pay in silver. And the awful thing is that sometimes that last one is entirely true, because the abbey and the Lord's household have contracts and standing orders, and they pay reliably, and the grain that comes to you goes where the money is, which is not to the family in the lane who already owes you 11 weeks. Now the town gets nervous, and a nervous medieval town does what towns always do. It regulates harder. Emergency ordinances. Forestalling and regrating, buying up grain before it reaches the market, or buying to resell at a profit, become the great crimes of the season, and courts that ignored them in fat years start hanging people's reputations on them in lean ones. Merchants are forbidden to export. Prices are capped. Inspectors multiply. And the men holding the balance in the marketplace get very, very interested in whether the baker's loaves are exactly the weight the schedule says they should be. Because in a hungry year, catching a baker short is not a fine, it's a public service. Meanwhile, you are trying to bake bread out of grain that is barely grain. Wet harvests meant sprouted wheat, and sprouted wheat makes dough that behaves like a living insult, slack, sticky, refusing to hold its shape, collapsing in the oven into a dense wet brick with a gummy centre. You cannot fix it. You can only compensate, stiffening the mix with whatever dry meal you can find, and the result is bread that is worse than last year's and smaller than last year's and costs the same, and you're the one handing it over. So you stretch it. Everyone stretches it. Rye goes in, then barley, then beans and peas ground down, then bran that would normally have gone to the pigs, and in the truly desperate seasons, things that had no business being in bread at all. Acorns, chestnuts, in the very worst places roots and ferns and bark. The guild forbids it. The court forbids it. And the town's own officers, who are hungry too, look at the loaf and look at the year and say nothing. because the alternative to bad bread is no bread, and no bread means the crowd. And here we should be honest about one particular danger in that grain, because it explains some of the strangest episodes in medieval history. Wet years favour a fungus that grows on rye. It produces dark, hardened bodies among the grain, and they look enough like grain that in a bad season, when every ounce counts and nobody is throwing anything away, they go into the mill along with everything else. What comes out the other end is flour laced with powerful compounds that constrict the blood vessels and disturb the mind. The result, recorded again and again across medieval Europe, especially in rye-eating regions after wet summers, was outbreaks of a condition people called by various names, most memorably a holy fire, a burning that came from within. Limbs went cold and dark, and in the worst cases were lost entirely. And in other outbreaks it took a different form, convulsions and vivid, terrifying hallucinations that swept through whole villages at once. Historians have argued about how many strange incidents in the record, mass visions, dancing manias, episodes of collective panic and accusation, may have had a bad harvest and a contaminated batch somewhere behind them. The arguments are unsettled, and probably always will be, but nobody at the time had any idea what was happening. They knew only that they had eaten bread, and then something had come for them. And they knew who gave them the bread. That's the position you occupy in a famine year, and it's why the baker's shop is where the anger finally lands. The Lord is behind a wall. The grain merchant is somewhere on the road with his wagons. The weather is God's business, and you can't shout at God. But the baker is right there, on the street, with an oven and a shop and a door, and everyone knows exactly where he lives. A bread riot doesn't usually begin with violence. It begins with a queue that gets longer than the supply, and a rumour moving down that queue, and then a moment. Someone says the baker has more in the back. Someone else says he sold a cart of it out the rear door before dawn to a buyer from another town, and the queue stops being a queue and becomes a crowd. Crowds in medieval towns had a repertoire. They forced the shop. They took the bread, and in a detail that says everything about how these people understood themselves, they very often paid for it. Not the asking price. What they considered the just price, the fair price, the price bread ought to be. Then they left the coins on the counter and walked out with the loaves. That's not looting in the modern sense. That's a community enforcing what it believed the law of bread was supposed to be, against a man they believed had broken it. The historian's term for the underlying idea is the moral economy, the deep conviction that food was not a commodity like any other, that there was a right price and a right weight, and that anyone who got rich from hunger had committed something closer to sacrilege than to sharp dealing. You are the man they enforce it on. And afterward, when the constables come and the court sits, you are also the man they investigate, to see whether the crowd had a point. Sometimes it went further than bread. Shops were wrecked. Ovens were pulled down, which was, in its way, the ultimate punishment, because it destroyed the thing that took a mason months and a fortune to build, and it announced to the whole town that this family no longer baked here. Bakers were beaten. Bakers fled. There are records across Europe of bakehouses standing empty after a bad season. The family gone to another town to start over as journeymen in someone else's shop, their name and their oven left behind. And there's a quieter horror underneath the loud one, which is what a famine year does to your books. Because your customers stop paying, not out of malice, they simply have nothing. The tally sticks lengthen. The credit you extended in autumn was supposed to be settled at harvest, and the harvest has failed, so it isn't settled, and now you must buy expensive grain with money you don't have to bake bread for people who cannot pay you for it. You go to the grain merchant and ask for credit yourself. He looks at the same fields you looked at and says no, or says yes at terms that will follow you for years. This is how bakers ended up in debt to men they hated. This is how family ovens changed hands. A trade that had passed from grandfather to father to son could end in a single bad 18 months. Not because anyone did anything wrong, but because it rained too much in the wrong 3 counties. And if you survive, if the next harvest comes in fat and golden, and the price of wheat drops through the floor, and the farthing loaf swells back up to its old generous size, do you get thanked? You do not. Prices fall, the loaves get big again, and everyone forgets. The same customer who accused you of hoarding in February takes his large loaf in September and says nothing at all. Because a large loaf is simply what a loaf is supposed to be. Your good years are invisible, only your bad ones are remembered, and only as your fault. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from this, and it isn't physical. You spend your whole life doing something genuinely essential. You are, quite literally, keeping the town alive. And the reward for doing it well is that nobody notices. And the reward for doing it under impossible conditions is public suspicion. The knight gets a song. The priest gets deference. The baker gets a cue and a rumour. And yet. There's a moment that happens most mornings, somewhere in the middle of all this, and it's the reason men stayed in the trade when they had every reason not to. It's the moment the first batch comes out. The oven has held its heat, the leaven was strong, the dough came together the way it should, and you draw the peel out, and there they are, risen properly, the crust gone deep and glossy, sounding hollow when you knock the base, the smell of it filling a room that smelled of ash and smoke an hour ago. You made that. Out of ground seed and water and time and fire, you made the single thing that this entire town runs on, and for about 90 seconds before the door opens and the shouting starts. It's the best thing anyone in the parish will touch all day. Nobody wrote that down. There's no chronicle entry for a good bake. But it happened. In every town in Europe, before dawn, several thousand times in the working life of every man who did this job. Which raises a question we haven't touched yet, and it's a strange one. If the trade was this punishing, this dangerous, this thankless, why was it so fiercely protected? Why did guilds fight in court for generations over who could bake what? Why did men serve 7 years unpaid for the right to do it? Because there was one thing a baker had that almost nobody else in the medieval world did. And it wasn't money. Certainty, that's the answer. And it sounds like a small thing until you remember what the medieval world was actually like for most of the people living in it. Almost everybody's livelihood was a gamble held hostage by weather, war, disease, and the whims of a man in a big house. The farmer prayed, the soldier bled, the labourer went where the work was, and starved when it wasn't. But bread did not go out of fashion. Bread did not have a slow season. There was never a week in 1,000 years of European history when the town collectively decided it wasn't in the mood for bread. A baker with an oven and a guild membership held something close to a guarantee. He would be poor, probably. He would be exhausted, certainly. But he would work. And he would work in the same building for his entire life, and his son would work there after him. In a world where most people had no floor beneath them at all, that was worth more than gold, and men fought for it accordingly. Which is why the road into the trade was made so deliberately long and so deliberately narrow. It began with apprenticeship, and if your father was a baker you might serve under him, but often you didn't. Many guilds preferred or outright required that a boy be bound to a different master, on the theory that a father would go soft on his own son and a stranger would not. So at 12 or 13 or 14, you were handed over. There was a contract, sealed and witnessed and registered with the guild, and it bound you for years. 5, 7, sometimes longer. In that document, your master promised to feed you, clothe you, house you, and teach you the mysteries of the craft. That was the actual language, the mystery of the trade, the accumulated secret knowledge that separated a man who could make bread from a man who could make bread reliably, at scale, at a profit, 6 days a week for 30 years. And you promised, in return, essentially everything. You could not marry. That was standard, and it was strictly enforced. and it's the detail that tells you the most about what an apprenticeship actually was. You were not an employee. You were a member of your master's household with the legal status of a child. And children do not take wives. You could not trade on your own account, could not leave without permission, could not frequent taverns or gamble or keep company the master disapproved of. You slept in the shop, very often on the floor near the oven, which was at least the warmest spot in the building, and one of the few genuine perks of the arrangement. You ate at his table. He could beat you, within limits the guild vaguely defined and rarely policed. And if you ran away, he could have you pursued and brought back, and your term extended as punishment. For years, you were paid nothing at all. Not a coin. Bed, board and instruction, that was the wage. Guild records across Europe are full of the frictions this produced. Apprentices complaining that a master taught them nothing and simply used them to haul wood for 7 years. Masters complaining that an apprentice was idle, insolent, thieving, or gone. Cases where a boy was returned to his family as unteachable, and cases where a master was fined for failing to feed his apprentice properly. It was a system that worked because everyone had gone through it, and it was defended ferociously because it controlled the one thing the guild cared about above all others: how many bakers there were. Because that was the real function underneath all the ceremony. Every master could take only so many apprentices. Every apprentice served a fixed and lengthy term. The result was a tap that could be turned, keeping the number of ovens in a town more or less matched to the number of mouths, protecting the men already inside from anyone new arriving to undercut them. Guilds are often described as trade associations, and they were, but they were also and primarily a wall. You were being taught a craft, yes, you were also being kept waiting. And what did they actually teach you in those years? Everything that could not be written down. How dough feels when the fermentation is right, which is a thing no words have ever adequately described and which every baker on earth still learns the same way. By touching thousands of batches and having someone older tell you not yet and now. How the sound of the oven changes as it comes up to heat. How to look at a delivery of flour and know from the colour and the smell and the way it packs in your fist whether it will behave. How to bring a leaven back from the edge of death. How to read the weather, because the weather changes the dough, and a humid August day and a dry frozen January morning demand different hands. You learned the timings, that the whole night was a chain of dependencies where a delay anywhere ruined everything after it. You learned to work in the dark. You learned to sleep in fragments, in the gaps, standing against a wall for a quarter hour while the second batch proved. You learned the burns, and you learned that you did not complain about them. And then, at the end of your term, you were free. Sort of. Now you were a journeyman from the French journe, a day, because you were finally worth paying by the day. You could work for wages. You could leave. In much of continental Europe, the custom was that you should leave, that a young craftsman should spend years on the road, moving from town to town and shop to shop, working a season here and a year there, gathering techniques and seeing how they did things elsewhere. The German tradition of the wandering years lasted, in some trades, into the modern era. It sounds romantic. It was mostly walking. You carried your tools, you carried a letter or a token proving your standing, and you presented yourself at the guild hall of whatever town you reached and asked who needed hands. Sometimes there was work, sometimes there wasn't, and you moved on with whatever bread you'd been given at the door. But for a young man from a bakehouse who had never in his life been more than a day's walk from the parish church, those years were the only freedom he would ever have. You saw cities. You saw ovens built differently, breads shaped in ways your father would have called wrong, a shop in some river town where they baked something with honey and spice that you'd remember for 40 years and never managed to reproduce. Journeyman bakers are one of the great unrecorded engines of how food spread across Europe. Nobody wrote down that a recipe travelled 200 miles in the head of a 20-year-old with sore feet, but that is exactly how a great deal of it moved. And then it ended, because it had to. You came home, or you settled somewhere, and you faced the wall. To become a master, to open your own shop, take your own apprentices, put your own mark on your own bread, you needed 3 things, and any one of them could stop you permanently. You needed the guild's permission. You needed to produce a masterpiece, an actual test bake judged by men who had every incentive to be harsh. And you needed capital, which was the real barrier and always had been. An oven. A building. Tools. A stock of grain. Fees to the guild, which in many towns were set at a level that quietly ensured only certain kinds of men could pay them. So how did a journeyman baker with no money get an oven? 2 ways. Mostly, he inherited one. Or, he married one. Let's be honest about how the second worked, because it was extremely common and nobody at the time pretended otherwise. A master baker died, and bakers did die, at rates that surprised nobody, leaving a widow, a shop, and a working oven. In most guilds, a widow was permitted to carry on her husband's trade, at least for a time. Sometimes for life. She had, after all, been doing half of it already, and often more than half, because here's the part that gets left out of nearly every picture of the medieval bakehouse. This was not a man's business. It was a household business, and the household was run by a woman. She mixed. She kneaded, in enormous quantities, often through the night alongside him. She managed the accounts and the tally sticks, and knew exactly who owed what, in a world where a great many men in the trade could not read or reckon well. She dealt with the customers at the front while he worked the oven at the back, which meant she was the one absorbing the complaints, the haggling, the requests for credit, and the accusations. She supervised the servants and the apprentices and fed them. In many towns she sold in the market herself. Whole categories of baking, the smaller wares, the cakes and wafers and pies, were frequently women's work by custom, sold by women, in shops run by women. Strip her out of the picture, and the bakehouse stops functioning inside a week. Which is exactly why the widow kept the shop, and exactly why an ambitious journeyman with good hands and no money found himself at her door with his cap off. Some of those marriages were affection. Many were arithmetic on both sides. She needed a man who could work the oven and satisfy the guild. He needed an oven. And the arrangement was so ordinary that in some towns it was practically a career path. Marry the widow, take the shop, take the name of the business, and quietly become the next baker at that address. Look closely at guild records over a few generations, and you'll find ovens outlasting the men who ran them by decades, passing sideways through marriages, the building continuous while the surnames change around it. And once you were a master, you were, finally, somebody. Not a rich man, not a great man, but a burgess, potentially a citizen with standing, entitled to a voice in the town's affairs, marching in the guild's place in processions, carrying its banner on feast days, sitting in its pew at church. The Bakers' Guild in many towns was old and respectable and wealthy in its collective way, with a hall, a patron saint, a chest of records, and enough political weight to make the town council listen. It buried its members with proper ceremony. It supported their widows and orphans out of a common fund. It paid for masses to be said for their souls. For a man whose grandfather had hauled firewood at 6 years old, that was not nothing. That was the whole point. So yes, the trade was brutal. The hours were inhuman, the heat was punishing, the oversight was humiliating, and the public thought you were a thief. But it was yours, permanently, in a world where almost nothing was permanent, and almost nothing was anyone's. Which brings us to the strangest chapter in this whole story. Because bread was never only food, and the baker was never only a tradesman. In a deeply religious world, the man who turned grain into loaves was standing very close to something sacred, close enough that the church had opinions about him, that his craft was tangled up in ritual and superstition and miracle, and that in some places it was seriously debated whether what he did was a trade at all, or something more like an act of worship. To understand what bread meant in the medieval mind, you have to let go of the idea that it was food. It was food, obviously, it was most of the food. But it was also, at the same time and without any contradiction, the single most sacred object in the entire Christian world, at the centre of every mass, in every church, in every village across Europe. A priest lifted a piece of bread and said words over it, and the whole of Christendom believed that something happened at that moment, that this ordinary substance, made from ground seed and water by a man in an apron, became the body of God. Nothing else in daily life carried that weight. Wine came close, but wine was a luxury in the north, and most people tasted it rarely. Bread was in every hand every day, which meant that the most common object in the medieval world was also its holiest one, and that collision produced 1,000 strange consequences for the man who baked it. Start with the practical end. Somebody had to make the wafers. The bread used at the altar was baked to precise standards, unleavened, made of pure wheat flour and water, nothing else, pressed between heated iron plates that stamped a cross or a sacred image into the surface. In monasteries, this was often done by the monks themselves, and it was treated as a devotional act, undertaken in silence or with psalms sung throughout, by men who had washed and prayed first. The flour might come from grain that was ground on a mill kept for that purpose alone. The irons were kept clean and blessed, any crumb that fell was gathered. But in towns it frequently fell to a baker, a specialist, sometimes a whole separate branch of the trade, the wafer makers, who in some cities had their own guild identity and their own quarrels with the bread bakers about who was allowed to make what. And if you held that work, you held the most delicate commission imaginable. You were baking, with your burned hands in your smoky room, the thing that would shortly be the body of Christ in the hands of a priest in front of the entire parish. The care that demanded was total. A wafer scorched was a wafer wasted, and wasting that particular bread was not a business loss, it was closer to a sin. A wafer with a crooked stamp, a wafer too thick, a wafer that crumbled, all of it mattered in a way no ordinary loaf ever did. And the offcuts, the trimmings from the sheets after the rounds were cut out, could not simply be swept up and thrown to the pigs. They were unconsecrated, technically ordinary, and yet nobody was comfortable treating them as ordinary. In many places they were eaten as a small blessed thing, sold or given away, and people valued them accordingly. Now widen out from the altar into the street, because this is where it gets genuinely strange. Ordinary people did not draw a clean line between the sacred bread in church and the bread in their own hands. Theology drew that line very sharply. Practice smudged it constantly, and the clergy spent centuries fighting a losing battle against the popular conviction that bread, all bread, was a little bit holy and could therefore do things. So loaves were marked with a cross before baking. Not decoration, not a family stamp, just a cross cut into the top with a knife. A gesture that survived into the modern era in kitchens all over Europe long after anyone could explain why. It blessed the loaf. It kept the devil out of the dough. It stopped the rising going wrong, which in a world with no understanding of what yeast actually was, felt like exactly the sort of thing that required supernatural insurance. Because think about what fermentation looked like to someone with no microbiology. You mix flour and water. You leave it. It swells. It breathes. It smells alive. It produces heat. It bubbles. And if you neglect it, it dies. And the words people used were exactly those words. The dough was alive and it had a spirit in it, and that spirit could be blessed or cursed, encouraged or driven off. Bakers made the sign of the cross over the trough. They said prayers when setting the leaven. In parts of Europe the custom persisted of never leaving a rising dough alone in a room with an open door, or of speaking a blessing when passing it, because something might get in. And when a batch failed for no reason you could see, when the leaven that had worked for 11 years suddenly went flat and sour and would not lift, what explanation was available to you? You had done everything the same. The flour was the same. So either God had withdrawn his favour from your house, or somebody had done something to you. That's the door through which suspicion walked in, and it walked in constantly. Bread appears everywhere in the folk magic of medieval and early modern Europe, on both sides of it. bread as protection, a piece of bread in the pocket against ill fortune, a crust under the pillow, bread and salt carried into a new house before anything else, so the home would never lack. Bread as a test, crumbs and loaves used in various regions to identify a thief or a liar, on the belief that guilt would make a man unable to swallow it. Bread as an offering, left out at certain nights of the year for whatever was believed to walk. Bread in burial customs, placed with the dead, or in some places given to a designated poor man who was believed to take on something of the dead person's burden by eating it. And then bread as a weapon, which is where the baker's household lived under a specific and permanent danger. If a village believed that a woman down the lane could sour milk with a glance, then she could certainly sour a dough. Witchcraft accusations across Europe cluster around exactly this sort of domestic misfortune: animals sickening, butter refusing to churn, children falling ill, and bread failing to rise. A run of collapsed batches, a leaven gone bad, an oven that suddenly wouldn't bake evenly, and the conversation in the shop would turn quietly to who had been at the door recently, who had asked for credit and been refused, who had left muttering. The horror of it is that the baker was as often the accuser as the accused. A woman refused bread on tick at the door, who left angry, whose neighbour's dough then failed. That pattern, repeated across hundreds of surviving cases in various forms, is how accusations were built. Guilt and fear and a sour batch and a name. But bakers themselves were vulnerable too, because they were the household with the strange knowledge. You worked at night. You commanded fire. You kept something alive in a crock, fed it, and refused to let it die. You transformed dead ground seed into something risen and warm. From a certain angle, at a certain moment, in a bad year, that could be made to sound like exactly the thing the preacher had been warning about. Bakers appear in the records of the fearful periods with unhappy regularity, and the pattern is always the same. A trade of transformation, practiced at night, in a town that had recently gone hungry. And of course the church had views about the working day as well, and those views cost you money. Sunday was the Lord's Day. So were the feasts, and there were a great many of them. Saints' days, holy days, festivals that in some regions accounted for a substantial fraction of the calendar. On those days you were not supposed to labour. The problem, which every bishop and every town council in Europe understood perfectly well, is that people still wanted to eat on holy days, and bread does not keep indefinitely, and the ovens were needed for the feast itself. So exemptions were carved out, argued over, revised, and quietly ignored. Bakers were frequently permitted to work when other trades could not, on the grounds of necessity, which sounds like a privilege and functioned as a sentence. It meant that the one day the carpenter and the weaver and the cooper rested, you did not. It meant the great festivals, the ones everyone else spent in the churchyard, drinking and dancing and watching the plays, were your busiest days of the year, because a feast needs bread and pies and cakes in quantities that no ordinary week demands. Christmas, Easter, the great parish festivals. You spent them in the same room you spent every other day, with the oven roaring, listening to the bells and the noise coming down the street, through a wall you never got to walk out of. And yet, and this matters, because it wasn't all deprivation, the church gave you things too. It gave you a saint. Bakers across Europe took various patrons, most commonly St. Honoratus, whose feast day became the baker's feast day and remains associated with the trade to this day. A patron meant a day that was genuinely yours, a procession, the guild banner carried through the streets. A mass said for the living and dead of the craft, a dinner afterward paid for out of the common chest. It meant that once a year the town looked at the bakers walking in order and understood them to be a body, an institution, a part of the place with a history and a claim. It gave you a chapel, or at least an altar, or a candle maintained by the guild in the parish church, kept burning at the fraternity's expense. It gave you the certainty that when you died, men from your own trade would carry you, and masses would be said for your soul, and your name would be read out among the departed brethren for years afterward. In a world where the greatest terror was dying unremembered and unprayed for, that was an extraordinary thing to be able to count on, and it gave you a role in the town's charity, which was where the baker's reputation finally, occasionally, turned in his favour. Alms were given in bread. Constantly, bequests in wills specified it in enormous detail, so many loaves of such a grade, distributed on such a day, at the church door or the graveside or the almshouse, for the good of the departed soul, sometimes annually forever. Funerals required doles of bread. Guilds and fraternities distributed it. Monasteries distributed it at the gate. Every one of those loaves had to be baked by somebody, and the somebody was you, working to a contract, held to a standard, delivering to a churchwarden who counted. So while the crowd in the market might curse you in February, in the same month you were probably baking the bread that fed them, paid for by a dead cloth merchant who wanted prayers said for him. You were embedded in the town's mercy as thoroughly as you were embedded in its complaints. Nobody thanked you for that either, but when the guild processed on the feast day, in good clothes, behind its banner, everybody watching understood something they didn't often say out loud, that these were the men who kept the town fed, in good years and bad, in famine and plague and war. And plague is where we're going next. Because in 1348, something arrived in Europe that broke every rule this trade had ever operated under, that emptied bakehouses, killed masters and apprentices in the same week, and left the survivors holding a bargaining position no baker had ever held before. It came up from the ports, and the bakers heard about it before most people did. Because the bakehouse was where the town gossiped at dawn, and because grain came in on the same ships and the same roads that everything else came in on. By the time it reached your street, in that terrible year at the middle of the 14th century, there had already been weeks of rumour. A town down the coast where the church bells rang all day, a village where nobody came out to the fields, a merchant who turned his cart around at a crossroads because of what he'd seen on the road ahead. And then somebody in your own parish was sick, and then a great many people were sick, and within a month a third of the faces you'd handed bread to across that counter every morning of your life were gone. Here is what plague did to a bakehouse, mechanically, before we get anywhere near the meaning of it. First, your apprentice died. Then, your journeyman. Apprentices and journeymen slept in the shop, shared the table, worked shoulder to shoulder in a hot enclosed room for 14 hours a day, and there was no arrangement in medieval life better designed to move a contagion through a household. Guild records from the plague years are, in places, simply lists, masters dead, apprenticeships voided by the death of the master, apprenticeships voided by the death of the apprentice, widows petitioning, sons of 11 and 12 suddenly named as heirs to businesses they could not possibly run. Second, the grain stopped coming, not because the fields failed. The harvests in those years were often fine, which was the ghastly irony of it, but because the men who reaped and carted and milled were dead or fled or too frightened to travel, and because whole village populations had collapsed with the wheat still standing. Chroniclers wrote about crops rotting in the fields for want of anyone to cut them, and animals wandering loose through the corn with nobody left to drive them out. You could stand in a bakehouse with an oven ready and money in the chest, and simply not be able to buy flour. Third, and worst in its own quiet way, the town stopped needing as much bread. That sounds almost like relief. It was not. Fewer mouths meant fewer customers, and every debt in your tally sticks belonged to somebody who might now be in a pit outside the walls, and the money owed to you died with them. And through all of it you kept working, because that was the one option available. There is something almost unbearable in imagining it. A man getting up at 2 a.m. in a town where the bells have been ringing for the dead all day, going down to a cold oven, building the fire in the dark, kneading, baking, and then opening the door at first light to a street where a quarter of the doors have a mark on them. What else was he going to do? People still had to eat. The ones who survived still queued. Bakers, priests, gravediggers, and physicians, those were the trades that could not withdraw, and the mortality among them reflects it. To bake was to stand at a door all day taking coins from hands and passing loaves back into them, breathing the same air as everybody in the parish in turn. There was no theory of contagion that would have helped you even if you'd wanted to protect yourself. The learned explanation involved corrupted air, bad vapours rising from the ground and from marshes and from the sick themselves, which meant the recommended defence was to carry sweet-smelling things and avoid foul ones, and above all, to flee. Leave early, go far, come back late, that was the advice of the physicians, and the people who could afford to take it did. You could not. Your oven was the business. An oven cannot be carried. And a baker who abandoned his town for a season might well come back to find someone else in the building and the guild unsympathetic. Then the strangeness started, because plague did something to the medieval mind that famine never had. Famine had causes people understood: rain, cold, war, bad luck, God's displeasure in a general way. This had no cause anyone could find, and it killed indiscriminately, and it kept coming back. So people looked for someone to blame, and they looked at the things that everybody touched, which meant food, which meant wells, which meant, in the darkest episodes of those years, the accusation of poisoning, and the pogroms that followed across Europe against Jewish communities on exactly that charge. Entire populations murdered on a rumour about wells and bread. It is one of the most shameful stretches in the history of the continent, and it was driven, in significant part, by the human refusal to accept that something can simply happen. And in that atmosphere, everyone who handled what other people put in their mouths became a potential suspect. Bakers were watched. Millers were watched. Anyone who could have put something in the flour was one bad rumour from a mob. And the flagellants came through, and the processions, and the preachers explaining that this was punishment for the sins of the age, and among the sins most frequently named were greed and dishonest trade and the taking of profit from the poor. Sit with that from behind a counter. The man in the market square shouting that God has struck Christendom because merchants cheat and tradesmen give short measure. Addressing a crowd that has spent 30 years assuming its baker keeps his thumb on the scale. But then the dying slowed. And then it stopped. And when the survivors came out and looked around, they found that the world had turned over completely. Because there were not enough people left to do the work. This is the part of the story nobody in 1348 could have predicted, and it changed the position of every working man in Europe. Labour had been the one thing that was always cheap and always abundant. There were more hands than there was work, which is why wages were low and why lords could hold peasants to old obligations, and why guilds spent so much energy keeping newcomers out. And then, in the space of 2 years, somewhere between a third and a half of the population was gone, and suddenly every skilled pair of hands in the country was worth something. Journeymen who had been begging for a season's work found masters bidding for them. Wages rose sharply and immediately. Apprentices who would have waited a decade for a shop found ovens standing empty with no heir to claim them and stepped straight into them. Widows remarried fast, and the men they married were younger and had less capital than would have been acceptable 5 years earlier, because the alternative was letting the business die. Guild entry requirements, so jealously guarded, were quietly relaxed in town after town because there was no other way to keep the trade staffed. Fees were waived, terms were shortened, restrictions on outsiders were suspended. For maybe a generation, being a baker was the best it had ever been. The authorities hated it, of course, and they responded exactly as you'd expect, with law. England passed ordinances and then statutes attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and to compel people to work for whoever asked them at the old rates. Similar measures went up across Europe. They were enforced with real vigour, and they failed, comprehensively, because you cannot legislate scarcity out of existence. Workers moved. They took the higher wage in the next town over and denied everything. The records fill up with prosecutions of labourers and craftsmen for the crime of being paid what someone was willing to pay them. And the resentment that built underneath all of it, the sense that the men who had survived the worst thing that had ever happened were now being legally forced back into a poverty the world no longer justified, is a direct ancestor of the great revolts that followed in England and France and Flanders in the decades after. For the bakehouse specifically, there was one more consequence, and it was more pleasant than any of that. The survivors ate better. With fewer mouths in the same fields, grain was abundant and cheap for decades. Wages were up and food was down, which is the rarest combination in the whole of pre-modern history, and ordinary working people spent the difference on exactly what you'd expect: better bread. The demand shifted upward. People who had eaten dark, coarse, mixed grain loaves all their lives began buying whiter, finer, wheaten bread, the sort that had been the food of the well-off. They bought meat. They bought ale. And they bought pies and cakes and the little baked luxuries that had never before had a mass market, which meant that a baker in the second half of that century was working in a genuinely different trade to his father. More wheat, less rye, better flour, more variety, customers with opinions and coins to back them. The fine white loaf, once the mark of a lord's table, became something a prosperous artisan expected on a Sunday, and in the towns, bakers began to specialise in ways that would have seemed absurd 100 years earlier. This shop for good white bread, that one for pastries and spiced goods, another for the plain stuff for the poor. It didn't last. It never does. Population recovered slowly over the following century, and as it did, the old pressures returned. More workers, lower wages, dearer grain, and guilds that promptly retightened every requirement they'd relaxed when they were desperate. The window closed, but it had been open, and everybody who lived through it remembered. And there's a detail that lingers from those years and says something about the temperament of the trade. Through all of it, the mortality, the empty streets, the mass graves, the mobs and the preachers and the collapse of the labour market, the bread got baked. Every morning. In town after town, right through the worst of it, there is evidence of bakers working, contracts being fulfilled, doles being distributed to the poor at church doors, ovens lit before dawn in parishes that had lost half their people. Not heroism exactly, just a man who knew that if he didn't light the fire, nobody would, and that hungry people in a frightened town are the last thing anybody needs. So he lit it. But the plague was not the only force that would reshape this trade. Something else was coming, slower and quieter, and in the long run it changed the baker's world far more completely than any pestilence. Not a disease, but a machine, and a new kind of grain, and a way of milling that would eventually take the oven out of the neighbourhood entirely. The machine came for the miller first, which meant it came for you. Because everything in the baker's world begins upstream, at the mill, and the mill was the most sophisticated piece of technology in the medieval landscape. Watermills had been turning for 1,000 years, and by the 12th and 13th centuries, the windmill had spread across northern Europe, and the sight of one on a ridge was so ordinary that people stopped remarking on it. Grain went in whole, flour came out, and between those two facts sat a man everyone in the village distrusted, and a set of physical limits that shaped every single loaf ever baked in medieval Europe. Here's the limit, and it matters more than it sounds. Millstones grind by crushing. They crush the whole grain together, the starchy interior, the bran layers, and the small, oily germ at the heart of it. Everything gets pulverized into one mixed meal, the bran in flakes and the germs smeared through the rest. So what comes back from the mill is dark, flecked and rich, and it will not keep, because the oil from the germ turns rancid within weeks. If you wanted white bread, you did not get it by milling differently, you got it by sifting. That was the whole business of fine flour, and it was punishing work. Bolting, they called it, and it meant shaking meal through cloth, coarse cloth for a rough sift, finer and finer weaves for better grades, and for the very finest, a silk or a tight-woven linen through which almost nothing passed. You shook, and what dropped through was pale and soft and prized, and what stayed behind in the cloth was bran and grit, and the greater part of what you had paid for. That is where the medieval social hierarchy of bread comes from, and it's purely physical. The finer the sift, the more you threw away, the more grain you needed for one loaf, the more it cost. A lord's white manchet loaf represented a great deal of discarded wheat. The servants ate what fell out of the cloth on the later passes, and the very last residue, coarse bran with whatever clung to it, was baked into the heavy dark loaves for the poorest, or into the bread officially designated for horses that the poorest ate anyway. You could tell a man's entire station by the colour of his bread, because colour was a direct readout of how much waste his household could afford. Nothing about that was symbolic. It was arithmetic, and it meant that a medieval baker, unlike a modern one, could not simply buy the grade of flour he wanted. He bought meal and made grades. Or he bought from a miller who had bolted it and charged accordingly, and either way the sifting was a constant background labour in the bakehouse, apprentices with cloths and frames, in a cloud of dust, producing 3 or 4 different flours out of one delivery, each destined for a different kind of customer. Then the mills got better, slowly, over centuries. The bolting itself was mechanised first, attached to the mill, driven by the same wheel, a rotating cylinder of graded cloth that shook the meal through automatically while the stones turned. That alone changed the economics, because now the miller could deliver sorted flour instead of raw meal, and a good deal of the drudgery moved out of the bakehouse. Then came refinements to the stones and their dressing, and multiple passes, and the gradual realization that if you ground gently and sifted between each pass, you could separate bran from interior far more cleanly than with a single brutal crushing. None of this happened quickly. These are developments spread across the late medieval and early modern centuries, town by town, mill by mill, and a baker in a small place in 1450 might be working with exactly what his great-grandfather had. But the direction was set. White flour, which had been an aristocratic luxury produced by throwing away most of your wheat, was becoming steadily cheaper to make. And then, much later, well past our period, but it's the end of the road this trade was walking down, came the roller mill, steel cylinders instead of stone, running at different speeds, cracking the grain open in stages so the bran could be stripped off in sheets and the germ removed entirely. It produced flour that was purely white, absolutely consistent, and, because the oily germ was gone, capable of sitting in a sack for a year without turning. The thing every baker in history had fought against, the perishability of flour, simply ceased to be a problem. That was the death sentence for the world we've been describing, though nobody saw it at the time. Consistent, storable, transportable flour meant bread could be made anywhere by anyone, in enormous quantities, in factories, and shipped. The local oven that the whole neighbourhood depended on stopped being necessary. The baker who read his flour with his fingers because every sack was different became obsolete, because the sacks stopped being different. But stay in the 14th and 15th centuries a moment longer, because there's a happier transformation happening at the same time, and it's the one that turned bakers into something more interesting than bread machines. The ovens got better, and when ovens get better, bakers get ambitious. Chimneys spread. That sounds trivial, and it was enormous. An oven that vented properly was an oven a man could work in front of without weeping, and more importantly, it was an oven with controllable draught, which meant more reliable heat. Iron doors replaced improvised stone and clay plugs, sealing the chamber and holding temperature far longer. Brickwork improved. And the falling curve of heat we talked about earlier, that long afternoon slope from fierce to gentle, stopped being a nuisance to be endured and started being a resource to be exploited. Because at each stage of that slope, something different can be cooked. So the medieval bakehouse became, over time, a much stranger and richer place than a bread shop. After the loaves came out, the oven still had hours of useful life in it, and every one of those hours could be sold. Neighbours sent pies, and the pie was the great medieval convenience food, a thick pastry case, often not even meant to be eaten, functioning as a sealed container that could hold meat or fish or fruit through a long bake and then be carried, stored and sold cold in the street. cook shops and pie sellers were a fixture of every sizable town, and they were, in the eyes of the public, even more suspect than bakers, because a sealed crust could contain absolutely anything, and by the time you found out it was too late. Then came the sweet things, as sugar and dried fruit and spices worked their way north and down the social ladder over the later medieval centuries. Spiced cakes for feast days, gingerbread, pressed into carved wooden moulds and sold at fairs, wafers, made in irons over the fire and sold hot in the street by wafer sellers, whose cries were part of the noise of every medieval city. Fritters, buns marked with a cross for the spring festivals. Enriched breads for weddings and funerals and the great turning points of the year, because every significant event in a person's life was marked with a particular baked thing, and the baker made all of them. And that last point deserves a moment, because it's how you were woven into the life of the town in a way no other trade quite was. You baked the bread at a christening feast. You baked what was distributed at a funeral. You baked whatever the local custom demanded at a wedding, and in many places the shape and the marking of that bread was fixed by tradition going back beyond memory. You baked for the guild dinners and the church ales and the harvest home. When the town celebrated, you were working. When the town grieved, you were working. You knew from the orders coming in who was getting married before the banns were read, who had money troubles because the funeral order was smaller than the family's standing required, and who had a child coming. The bakehouse was an information exchange, and everyone knew it. It was warm, it was open before anything else, and half the parish passed through it every morning. If you wanted to know what was happening in a medieval town, you did not ask the bailiff. You stood near the bread queue for 20 minutes, which cut both ways. Naturally, bakers heard everything, which meant bakers were assumed to repeat everything, and a baker with a loose tongue could make an enemy who would spend years waiting for a light loaf. Meanwhile, the trade was fragmenting into specialists, and the guilds were fighting about it in courts across Europe with a bitterness that seems absurd until you remember what was at stake. White bakers against brown bakers, bread bakers against pastry cooks, bakers against the cook shops, bakers against anyone who owned an oven and started taking in neighbours' dough for a fee without paying the guild's dues. Enormous quantities of parchment and legal expense went into the question of whether a man who made spiced cakes was practicing the baker's craft or a different one entirely, and the answer varied by city and by century, and was almost never settled to anyone's satisfaction. To an outsider ridiculous, to the men involved, it was the boundary of their livelihood, drawn in a world where a trade you could not exclude others from was a trade that would not feed your children. And underneath all of it, the fundamental job had not changed one bit since the Bronze Age. Grind seed. Add water. Wait for something invisible to make it rise. Apply heat. The techniques got better. The ovens got better. The flour got whiter. The range of products expanded. But a baker from ancient Egypt dropped into a 15th century bakehouse would have needed about a day to figure out the tools, and would have understood everything else immediately. Same dough, same fire, same waiting, same terrible hours, which is worth remembering as we approach the end of this story, because when the change finally came, it came fast enough to break that 4,000-year continuity within a couple of generations. Steam, steel, railways carrying grain from the other side of the world. Purified yeast sold in blocks, so that the mysterious living thing in the crock became a product on a shelf. Factories with ovens the size of a house. And a whole way of life, the night work, the neighbourhood oven, the family mark cut into the crust, the man who knew every household in the parish by the bread they ordered, went quietly out of existence. Before that, though, there's one more part of the medieval baker's world we haven't looked at properly. His body. What 30 or 40 years of this actually did to a man. How he ate, how he slept, what he died of, and what happened to the shop when he could no longer lift the peel. Let's talk about what the trade did to a man, because the record of it is written on the bodies of bakers in a way that's remarkably consistent across centuries and countries. Start with the sleep, since that's the foundation everything else rests on. You do not sleep in one piece. You never have. From your first year as an apprentice to the last morning you can still stand, your rest is broken into fragments arranged around the oven's demands, down at midnight or 1 or 2, work until mid-morning, and then a stretch in the afternoon if the day allows. Which it frequently doesn't, because somebody's dough needs baking, or the wood delivery arrives, or the oven needs raking out for tomorrow. Interestingly, that was not as unusual in the medieval world as it sounds to us. There's good evidence that the segmented night, a first sleep, a wakeful hour or 2 in the middle, then a second sleep, was ordinary for a great many people before artificial light rearranged everything. People woke in the small hours, prayed, talked, tended the fire, and went back down. So a baker's schedule sat inside a world that was already more comfortable with the middle of the night than ours is. But ordinary people woke in the dark and went back to bed. You woke in the dark and went to work, every night, for 40 years, and the cumulative debt of that never gets paid. You are permanently structurally tired. You fall asleep sitting down mid-conversation at church. Your temper is short, and everyone in your household knows the particular hour of the afternoon when it is unwise to ask you anything. Bakers had a reputation for being surly, and you can trace that reputation directly to a work schedule that guaranteed it. Then, the heat. Working in front of an open oven mouth is a slow, cumulative assault. The face and the forearms take the worst of it. The skin thickens, reddens permanently, and takes on a look that made bakers recognisable in the street. The eyes suffer decades of squinting into a glowing chamber with smoke and steam and flour dust, and the result is inflammation, watering, and by middle age a real decline in sight. Reading a weight schedule, if you could read at all, became a struggle at 50. Judging the colour of an oven floor became harder exactly as your reputation depended on it most. And the burns, which we've mentioned but which deserve their proper weight. Not one dramatic injury, but thousands of small ones layered over the same patches of skin, year after year, in a room with no clean water and no understanding of infection. Most healed, some didn't. A burn on the forearm that went septic in a bakehouse in 1380 was a genuine threat to a man's life, and the treatment available was a poultice, a prayer, and luck. Then the back and the shoulders, which is what actually ends most baking careers. The motions are brutally repetitive and always the same. Kneading, bent forward at the trough, arm deep, driving down with the heels of the hands for hours, lifting sacks of flour and stacks of wood. And the peel, the long lever held out at full extension with a weight on the far end, worked in rapid repetition, which is about the most efficient way ever devised to destroy a rotator cuff. Bakers' shoulders went, bakers' lower backs went, and once they went, there was no adjustment available, no lighter duty, no way to bake bread that doesn't involve those exact movements. Then the lungs. Flour dust, breathed continuously in an enclosed space, produces a chronic irritation of the airways that has been recognised under one name or another since antiquity, and has followed bakers straight into the modern world, where it remains one of the classic occupational respiratory conditions. Add the smoke, because even with a chimney, a wood-fired oven in a small room fills that room, and you have a man who by 50 wheezes climbing his own stairs, and the skin of the hands, which after 30 years of flour and water and heat is cracked, hardened and permanently dry, splitting at the knuckles every winter. None of this was regarded as remarkable. There was no concept of an occupational disease, and no expectation that work should leave you intact. This was simply what happened to bakers, in the same way that smiths went deaf, and tanners smelled, and miners died young. You watched it happen to your master, and then you watched it happen to yourself, and there was no version of the story in which it didn't. Now the counterweight, and it's a real one, you ate. This is the great compensation of the trade, and it should not be underestimated in a world where hunger was the ordinary condition. There was always bread in the house. There was always the misshapen loaf, the one that stuck to its neighbour, the batch that came out overdone. All of it went to the household table. There was warmth, permanently, in a century when cold killed people every winter and fuel was a genuine expense. A bakehouse in January was the best place in the parish to be, and beggars slept against the outside wall for exactly that reason. Bakers' families were, on the whole, better fed than most of their neighbours, and it showed. The stock image of the fat baker is not entirely a slander. A man surrounded by carbohydrate, working brutal hours, with ale as his main drink because the water was unsafe, that's a particular physique, and it was common enough to become a stereotype. Ale, incidentally, deserves a note, because bakers drank a great deal of it and had good reason to. It was hydration in a hot room, calories, and in some households it was a business relationship. Since brewer's barm, the yeasty froth-off fermenting ale, was one of the best leavens available. Brewing and baking sat next to each other in the medieval economy, sharing grain, sharing yeast, sharing regulation under the same assize. A great many bakehouses had a brewhouse nearby, and a great many arrangements between them were sealed over a cup. So the picture of the middle-aged baker, well-fed, red-faced, short-tempered, half-deafened by nothing in particular but hoarse and wheezing, with ruined shoulders, thickened hands, dim eyes, and an intimate knowledge of everyone in the parish. Prosperous by the standards of the street, broken by the standards of the body. And then it ends, and how it ends depends entirely on whether you have a son. The transition, when it worked, was gradual and dignified. You stop doing the peel first, because that's the motion the shoulder refuses. Your son takes the oven. You keep the trough for a while, then that goes too. You move to the front, the counter, the customers, the accounts, the weighing, the arguing with the warden, and that's a real job, and a man who has been in the trade 50 years is extremely good at it. You sit in the corner where it's warm and you tell the apprentice he's doing it wrong, which he is, and which is the ancient privilege of every old craftsman in every trade that has ever existed. And the guild carries you the rest of the way. That was the whole reason it existed, underneath the price disputes and the processions. A common chest, contributed to by every member for their entire working life, that paid out when a brother was too old or too ill or too injured to work. It supported widows, it apprenticed orphans, it paid for the funeral, and for the masses afterward, and for candles. It meant that a man who had spent 40 years in a hot room could reasonably expect not to die in the road, which was more security than most people in medieval Europe had access to in any form. If you had no son, the shop passed sideways, to a daughter's husband, to a journeyman who married your widow, to whoever the guild and the family could arrange between them. Ovens outlived people. That's the theme of this whole story, really. The brick chamber your grandfather commissioned would still be baking bread in a century, under names that had nothing to do with yours, and nobody in the street would remember who built it. And when you died, the parish noticed in a way it noticed almost nobody else's death, because for 40 years you had handed bread across a counter to every household in that street. You knew their children's names, you had carried their debts through the bad winters and quietly written some of them off. You had baked for their weddings and their burials. There was no other tradesman in a medieval town with that density of daily contact. The smith saw you when something broke. The tailor a few times a year, the priest on Sundays. The baker saw everyone, every single morning for a lifetime. They complained about you constantly, and they would have been lost without you, and both of those things were true at once, and everybody knew it. The funeral was a guild affair. The brethren came in their livery, the banner was carried, the bell was paid for. Bread was distributed at the door for the good of your soul, baked in an oven you had probably built up from cold 10,000 times. There is something fitting about that, and I doubt anyone at the time thought about it for a second. Your grave, if you got a marker at all, said nothing about what you did. Bakers do not get effigies. There are no monuments to the man who kept a town fed through a famine year. The great churches of Europe were, in significant part, paid for by trade guilds, and the bakers of many cities contributed windows and chapels and altars. So if you want a memorial to this trade, look up at the stained glass in an old European cathedral and find the panels showing men at ovens and troughs and mills. They're there, in Chartres and elsewhere, put up by the guilds that paid for the window, showing their own work in coloured glass beside the saints. That's as close as a baker ever got to a monument, and it's not nothing. So what was it all for? 40 years of getting up at 2 a.m, a body ruined by 50, public suspicion, legal harassment, and the constant risk of burning down your own street. We'll finish with that question in the last section. And with the thing that happened next, the century in which everything we've described was swept away and replaced. And what got lost when the neighbourhood oven went cold for the last time. The end came from a place nobody was watching. Not from the guilds, which had survived plagues and famines and revolts, and were still arguing about jurisdiction in the 18th century as if nothing had changed. Not from the church, or the courts, or the assize inspectors with their balances. It came from steam, and from steel, and from railways, and from the simple fact that once you can move grain cheaply across an ocean and grind it into flour that keeps for a year, there is no longer any reason for every neighbourhood in every town to have its own oven and its own man in an apron who never sleeps. It happened over roughly a century, and it happened everywhere. The mills went first, as we said. Roller milling stripped the bran and the germ away and produced flour that was blindingly white, endlessly consistent, and effectively immortal in a sack. Every skill a baker had built his life on assumed the opposite. Reading a delivery with your fingers, adjusting for a damp harvest, compensating for grain that had sprouted in the rain, knowing that the sack from this mill behaved differently from the sack from that one, all of that expertise, accumulated over 7 years of apprenticeship and 40 years of practice, became unnecessary within a generation. The flour was just the flour now. It did the same thing every time. Then the leaven went. That living thing in the crock, fed and wrapped and taken to bed on cold nights. The mysterious spirit in the dough that had to be blessed and protected and could not be allowed to die, it turned out to be a fungus, identifiable under a microscope, cultivable in a factory, and sellable in a compressed block. You could buy it. You could buy it in a shop, use it, and buy more next week. The single most closely guarded possession of every bakehouse in Europe became a commodity item on a shelf, and with it went the reason bakers had made the sign of the cross over the trough for 1,000 years. Then the ovens. Steam pipes, then gas, then electricity, with a dial on the front that said what temperature it was, which meant the hand held in the mouth of the oven and the pinch of scattered flour and the colour of the brick, the great unwritable skill, the thing that took a decade to learn, was replaced by a number that anyone could read. And then the factories, and the bread that arrives sliced in a wrapper on a lorry, made in a building most people have never seen, by processes designed to compress the fermentation that used to take all night down into a couple of hours. Every one of those changes was, on its own terms, an improvement. That has to be said plainly, because it's easy to get sentimental at this point in the story, and sentiment would be a disservice to the people who actually lived it. Cheap, safe, consistent bread ended a category of human suffering that had been permanent since the invention of agriculture. No adulteration with bran and chalk, and worse. No ergot in the rye. No famine year where the loaf shrinks to nothing and the crowd gathers outside a shop with nothing in it. No family destroyed because it rained too much in the wrong 3 counties. If you offered a 14th century baker's wife a world where bread was always available, always the same, always safe, and cost a fraction of a day's wage, she would not have hesitated for a second, and she would have been right. But something did go, and it's worth naming because it's the thing this whole long night has really been about. What went was the man in the middle. For most of human history, between the field and the mouth there stood a person you knew. He lived on your street. You saw him every morning. He knew your family's mark and how many loaves you took, and that your father had been ill, and that you were 3 weeks behind. He was in your church and at your funerals, and his oven was where your dough went, and where your neighbours gathered, and where the news of the parish was traded before dawn. You complained about him bitterly, and you suspected him of cheating you, and you would have rioted at his door in a bad year. And all of that was possible precisely because he was there, a person, accountable, within arm's reach. That relationship was the ordinary shape of eating for 4,000 years, and it is now almost entirely gone, and it went so quietly that nobody marked the date. The traces are still with us though if you know where to look, and most of them are so ordinary that we don't see them at all. The extra loaf in a batch of 12, because a baker was afraid of the pillory. The cross cut into the top of a loaf before it goes in the oven, from a time when that was insurance against the devil getting into the dough. Words we use without thinking. The Lord, from the old term for the keeper of the loaf, the man who had bread to give. The lady, the one who needed it. The companion, from the Latin for the one you share bread with. Every one of those words is a fossil of a world where bread organised everything, who had power, who owed loyalty, who ate with whom. The shapes survive too, the spring buns marked with a cross, the wedding cakes and funeral dolls and harvest loaves and festival breads that persist in villages across Europe, made for reasons nobody in the village can any longer explain, because the reason died 4 centuries ago and the shape kept going. And the trade itself never quite died. It went small and it went specialist, and for a while in the 20th century it looked like it might disappear entirely, and then, in the last few decades, a certain number of people started getting up at 2 a.m. again, on purpose, to make bread slowly out of a living leaven kept in a crock and fed like a pet, in ovens they read by eye. They call it artisan baking. What it is, precisely, is the 14th century, chosen voluntarily, by people who could have done something else. Which brings us back to the question we left hanging. What was it all for? 40 years of waking at 2 a.m, a body wrecked by 50, the shoulders, the back, the lungs, the eyes, the forearms mapped with burns, public suspicion as a permanent condition, laws that could put you in a wooden frame in the marketplace with your own bread hung around your neck, the constant low, sleepless dread of the fire getting out, no song, no monument, no chronicle entry, and a grave with a name on it, and nothing about the work. For what? I think the honest answer is the one the baker himself would have given if you'd asked him at the wrong hour and he'd bothered to reply. Because the town had to eat. Not a noble answer, not a heroic one, but there is a particular kind of person who holds the world together, and they are never the people the chronicles are about. The chronicles are about kings and battles and the movements of armies. They are not about the man who lit the fire in the dark so that 1,000 people could have breakfast, every day, for his entire life, including the days when the plague was in the parish and the bells hadn't stopped ringing since morning. He lit it then too. Somebody had to. And that's the strange dignity buried under all the misery in this story. The baker was not celebrated, and he knew he wasn't. He was regulated, inspected, suspected, and occasionally dragged through the mud. But he also knew, with a certainty that must have been quite warming on a cold night, that if he stopped, everything stopped. The knights and the merchants and the priests and the lords in their halls all ate bread that a man like him had made with his hands. The whole ornate structure of the medieval world, the cathedrals and the crusades and the courts and the poetry, rested on the fact that somewhere, before dawn, somebody was kneading. He never got told that. But he knew, so the next time you eat a piece of bread, and you probably will today, without giving it a moment's thought, because that is the entire triumph of the last 2 centuries, spare a second for the man in the hot room, for the leaven kept alive through the winter in a crock beside the bed, for the hand held in the oven mouth counting, for the mark cut into a neighbour's loaf so it would come back to the right family, for the tally sticks with the debts of people who died before they could pay, for the burned forearms and the ruined shoulders and the extra 13th loaf. He didn't build anything you can visit. He left no book, no monument, no name. He left something better and harder to see. 1,000 years of ordinary mornings where the bread was ready when people came to the door. And the fire he lit at 2 a.m, that fire never really went out. It just moved. Into gas and steel and factories and the shop on the corner and the kitchen where somebody, this weekend, we'll decide to try making a loaf by hand and discover, about 4 hours in, exactly how much work it is. Sleep well, history lovers. The oven is banked, the dough is covered, and there's nothing more to do until 2. If you made it this far, thank you. Genuinely, this channel exists because a quiet, strange, wonderful group of people find it restful to fall asleep inside the past, and I'm always a little amazed by that. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, a like helps more than you'd think. And subscribing means the next one finds you. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from and whether you made it to the end or drifted off somewhere around the plague. No judgment either way, that's rather the point. Rest well. We'll go somewhere else entirely tomorrow night. Peace.